Okay, I want to sort of get later on into the India-China relations, because this is absolutely critical to US-India relations. But let me just sort of widen the aperture a little bit. As I said at the beginning, you know, we've had successive US administrations, Republican and Democratic, wanting India to succeed. And part of that is to do with the sort of thrivingness of Indian Americans here in the United States. Part of it is to do with the fact that India is a democracy, a plural, very plural one. But a lot of that's got to do with China, with India being that counterweight to China. And therefore, there's been quite a bit of forbearance from US administrations, including on trade. We have got, allegedly, a US-India trade deal coming today. What would be, Shaurya, what would be your red lines? I mean, I know that the price of onions in India can bring down state governments. It can bring farmers onto the streets. You know, you don't have a big soy production sector, so maybe there's some room there. But H-1B visas, something that Trump's base do not like, but is really quite important to many, many Indians. What are your red lines for this deal? Does the Indonesia-US deal or the Vietnam-US deal give you any pointers? And what do you expect to see, assuming we are imminently going to get a Trump-India deal?
So I think that, you know, first is that that this deal will, if this deal ever happens, will actually not touch on, not be able to, India will not sort of negotiate its interests away for just getting a deal with the United States. That's very clear. India is just too big a power now and an economic weight of itself that, you know, while a deal with America is desirable, if a deal doesn't happen, it's not the end of the world for India. There are certain red lines in India with regard to with this deal, particularly the agriculture sector. You know, India has 60% of its population, which still depends on agriculture, and there is just no way India will do a deal, I think at least, on the agriculture sector. If the trade-off on that is the H-1B visas, yes, it will have some impact on the Indian diaspora and the sort of the educated Indians, but that politically is not a very relevant factor. So I don't think India will compromise on that. I think where India would look to do is to try and see if it can get a reasonably fair deal done with the United States on other areas. But I don't know what the US's negotiating position is, that if it's going to be very hard-nosed on trying to force you know, sort of the US interests at any costs, then I think in India they will find a very tough negotiator.
I mean, you don't, Shaurya, just to follow up, you don't, as Indians, have the same leverage that China has, right? China has this stranglehold on certain rare earths and critical minerals and the processing of them, and that has caused Trump to sort of climb down. You don't have any equivalent leverage.
But the corollary is that we as a $4 trillion economy have, you know, our trade with the US is a very small percentage of the size of our economy. We're not essentially an export-oriented economy. We're essentially a domestic economy, 4 trillion growing at about 8 to 10%. Right? So while it's desirable for us to have a deal, but even if the United States and we don't have a deal, that will not in any meaningful way stop India's trajectory, unlike China, which is more dependent on the United States.
Okay, Sachin, I want to sort of get back to that. Azim Munir, Pakistan military chief, I know you don't want to discuss Trump's lunch arrangements, but it was extraordinary that the statement that came out afterwards from the Pakistanis and the Americans, that they said they discussed cryptocurrency. It's like, first of all, I'm trying to get my head around Trump meeting with the military leader alone. Second, they discuss cryptocurrency. And I think that sort of gives an indication of what motivates some of these deals. How are you, as a prominent Indian politician, viewing the sort of the playing field here?
I think it's changing very quickly, very rapidly, and the unpredictable nature of how things are evolving is a matter of concern. I don't want to speculate on the news reports about the army chief of Pakistan meeting the US president and talking about bitcoins and so on. That's probably speculation as of now. But what's far more remarkable is the fact that the US president was having to deal with the chief of the army staff in Pakistan, not the elected government or its foreign minister or its prime minister. That tells you that for the last 75 years, India has actually worked really hard to preserve its democratic roots. In that region, I won't take names, but not many nation states have a vibrant, functional democracy like we do. That is the reason why the army has so much leverage in most of our countries in the neighborhood. And that's why General Munir was called for lunch and not the elected government of Pakistan. Enough said about that, but I'm more concerned about what's happening in our neighborhood because it's okay for the US to be concerned about adversaries which are 8,000 miles away. But the US is quite lucky in terms of its neighborhood. Some of them are friendly, some are not willing to be bought out, and you have oceans on both sides. But India has a very different neighborhood, and we have to navigate that landscape on our own. Therefore, whatever we decide to do in terms of our internal security issues, our border issues, our foreign policy issues, our immediate neighborhood, are singularly focused on protecting our own national interests. And like you said, to counterbalance the region as such, I think India has a pivotal role to play, irrespective of who's in government in the US and who's in government in India. Because the post-Second World War reality is what it is. And we have to recognize the fact that India houses 1/6 of humanity. We have a huge young population whose average age is 29 years, a lot of growth potential, and I think people want to be a part and be a stakeholder in that growth. So we don't want anyone or anything to impede that growth trajectory. Therefore, I think it's in the interest of everybody to work in a collaboration, to actually work on the things that suit everybody, including global peace and regional security.
And do you see that happening?
Not to its potential. I think there's always scope to improve. Like I said, the landscape is changing so quickly in the last 6-8 months. I don't want to make predictions, but I'm just establishing what we as a country stand for and what we need to do moving on in the future.
Okay, well, that neighborhood point, I think it was Henry Kissinger said India lives in a difficult neighborhood, right? And I mean, I think a lot of Indians think that Kissinger didn't make it safer, but that's a whole different conversation. Sumit, this idea that I think Vajpayee and Bush Jr. articulated that the US and India were natural allies, and that therefore this is a long-term thing that's from administration to administration, from government, BJP, Congress, whatever, there is a constancy here. Are we still sort of confident that that is the trajectory?
Yes, I believe so. Because during the Cold War, India and the United States really didn't have any meaningful relationship. There was no significant economic relationship because of India's autarkic economic policies. India pursued non-alignment, sort of, and was distrustful of the United States largely because of its relationship with Pakistan, which had been forged as early as 1954. So there was not much of a diplomatic relationship. And above all, there was no strategic relationship with the name because India either manufactured weaponry on its own or after 1971 became acutely dependent on the Soviet Union. Consequently, the relationship, as Hans Morgenthau, the great political scientist, characterized it, was a relationship of making faces at each other. And consequently, it was of there was no real substance. Today, it's a vastly different relationship. There's a significant and powerful Indian diaspora in this country. There is a meaningful economic relationship, admittedly nothing like the US has with China, but nevertheless, it is a viable economic relationship. Thirdly, India in the last 2 decades has purchased over $20 billion worth of military equipment, and not just garden variety military equipment, high technology military equipment from the United States. There are components of American aerospace equipment which are being manufactured in India today. The diplomatic relationship has undergone a fundamental transformation. There is a bipartisan consensus, both in India and here in the United States, that this relationship is of significance. And consequently, there will be hiccups in 2 democratic countries. Administrations will change. There'll be different prime ministers, different parties in power. And so there will be an ebb and flow. But I cannot see the relationship plummeting.